Now, for more on this story, we can speak with Lee Jarvis, an international security expert at the University of East Anglia. Thank you for joining us here on the program. Now, as of now, police say that there are no further threats, but that 9 people are currently being questioned. And police say that 2 significant arrests were made earlier today. What do you make of this?
Well, I guess there are a couple of things to make of this. Firstly, it's very early to speak definitively about what was behind the attacks, what motivated the individual, and what's going on now. And I think it's really important to let that investigation play out. The second thing to say is that although this individual has been widely described as a so-called lone actor terrorist or a lone wolf terrorist, that label in itself is a little misleading, because the types of individuals we think about and talk about in that way are often connected to others, family, friends, communities. They leave traces behind and so forth, that individuals very, very rarely are entirely isolated from those around them.
Indeed. Now, we do have the Islamic State that's claimed responsibility for this attack, but of course it's unclear yet as to what links, if any, there have been with the group, and police are working on the assumption as of now that it was inspired. How important is it to differentiate between an attack that was directed, enabled, and inspired by a group?
Well, lots of people would make an argument that this is part of the nature of contemporary types of terrorism, that if this indeed it does turn out to be the case, that this is indicative of the much more nebulous, looser, unconnected types of terrorist violence that we see today versus older forms of more organised, more coherent groups. In the British example, the case of the Provisional IRA, for example. But as I say, it's still very early to make those assumptions or to do anything more than work with those as assumptions.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move then from assumptions to some things. People have been talking about the nature of this attack, saying that it was rather low-tech, a car that anyone can get their hands on, as well as a knife in terms of the weapon. And as of now, a homegrown lone wolf is the word that we've been using in terms of describing the attacker. So people are saying this is an attack that's difficult to prevent. Do you agree with that? And what do you think can be learned or improved upon in terms of reaction by security forces?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that it's really important to bear in mind that counter-terrorism policy, or security policy more generally, is fiendishly difficult. That if we're dealing with violent individuals, we're thinking about individuals who are wanting to keep their behaviour secret and clandestine and hidden, whose behaviour will be reactive and responsive to events around them. And I think some of the criticism or the questions that have been raised in relation to the police and the intelligence services about why this individual hadn't been picked up sooner and so forth are harsh. And I think we need to bear that type of thing in mind. It's certainly the case that individuals acting on their own are less vulnerable to some of the more traditional types of counter-terrorism strategies. So they're less vulnerable to infiltration, for example, because they, by definition, are working on their own. And it's clearly the case that political violence is always a product of its time, that people that would cause harm to others use technologies and weapons and resources that are available to them. And in this case, as we've seen, vehicles and knives are very, very easily accessible.
What about then in terms of the response? Of course, the officer who was killed was Keith Palmer, and he was unarmed. Do you think authorities should reconsider the policing resources there?
I think if you look at the history of counter-terrorism in countries like Britain, one of the lessons we can gain from that is that there's been a temptation or a tendency to overreact to traumatic and tragic events such as this. And this is to take nothing away from the horror that his family and the families of the other victims will be experiencing. But I think it doesn't make for very good security policy to respond to events like this with dramatic or excessive forms of new security power and measures, such as greater arming of police forces or some of the other counter-terrorism policies that have been a feature of the last 10 or 15 years or so.
Lee Jarvis, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. We do appreciate it.